Hey folks, welcome back to the Bend Entertainment Network. I'm DJ Sally H, and today we're talking affirmative action in the Asian community. Call in now to have your voice heard. Our first caller is Sean from Dayton. Sean from Dayton, how are you?
I'm great, DJ Sally, but I've got some real issues with affirmative action. I think that consideration of the color of our skin should be non-negotiable. That shouldn't even be an admissible part of the criteria for admission.
Sean, thanks so much for that thought. I totally agree. Skin color is totally irrelevant to the discussion here.
Yep, so that's why universities shouldn't use race.
Whoa, Sean. Making leaps there. I think you might be making a little equivocation there, buddy. Race and skin color aren't the same thing.
What? Yes, they are.
Sean, please enlighten me. What is the skin color that all Asian people have?
Well, universities shouldn't be able to consider the place where you were born as criteria.
Sean, again, same page here. Totally agree. Definitely some big implications for immigration policy there, but that's for another time. However, I'm still not seeing the leap to race here. Lots of Asian people were born in the U.S., and many Asian people have been in the U.S. for generations. I'm sorry, pal. Race isn't about where you were born.
Well, what is race about if you know everything?
Sean, my boy, that is a great question. This video is part 2 where we attempt to answer the question, what is race? And this video is going to make a lot more sense if you have watched part 1, so you should definitely do that. To refresh your memory, the last video we talked about biological racial realism, which was defended by Quayshawn Spencer. And then we recognized that there was a lot of problems with biological racial realism, so we turned to Kwame Anthony Appiah and Joshua Glasgow for an anti-realist view of race. Anti-realism is just the view that race doesn't exist. This kind of ended us in a strange problem where Joshua Glasgow was saying that races don't exist, but then he started talking about racialized groups. And so today we're going to look a little closer at this, and we're going to use this to help us understand a very popular answer to the question, what is race? We're going to hear 2 versions of the answer we're going to hear today, one defended by Chike Jeffers and the other by Sally Haslanger. Chike Jeffers is what's called a social constructionist about race. He believes that Joshua Glasgow is basically a social constructionist, but he's in denial. To understand what Jeffers means, let's find out what it means to be a racial social constructionist. Perhaps the earliest social constructionist was W.E.B. DuBois.
Although the wonderful developments of human history teach that the grosser physical differences of color, hair, and bone go but a short way toward explaining the different roles which groups of men have played in human progress, yet there are differences, subtle, delicate, and elusive though they may be, which have silently but definitely separated men into groups. While these subtle forces have generally followed the natural cleavage of common blood, descent, and physical peculiarities, they have at other times swept across and ignored these. At all times, however, they have divided human beings into races, which, while they perhaps transcend scientific definition, nevertheless are clearly defined to the eye of the historian and sociologist.
Social constructionist theories about race tell us that people are talking about something when they talk about race, but they kind of are confused about what race is. To use a metaphor from the last video, Jeffers thinks that race is more like a whale than a mermaid. Social constructionists claim that Quayshawn Spencer is wrong that race is biological, but he is correct when he says that race is real. In Jeffers' words, social constructionists about race take appearance and ancestry to be very significant, not as a matter of biological reality that we discover by looking at the world, but as a matter of social reality that we produce and maintain through widespread patterns of thought and behavior. In fact, Glasgow actually gave us a great approach to this. Races are just the racialized groups. We all admit that there are racialized groups of people who are assigned a social status based on their specific appearances. Aren't those groups just races? Racialized groups are what we mean when we say Black people or Asian people. Social constructionists agree almost entirely with Glasgow. The only difference is that Glasgow thinks that we should give up on the word race. and Jeffers believes that we can just accept that whales are mammals and not fish. Glasgow argues that our ordinary concept of race is confused, but do his thought experiments really show that these ideas are essential to race talk? I think that Jeffers says it best.
Glasgow's claim is that people who conceive of race as a social construct do so in a manner that does not accord with the ordinary understanding of the term. This is not something a social constructionist should feel the need to protest. Why should we deny that it remains common for people to understand race as something naturally inherited and not dependent upon any social facts?
Does it really help to ask people to say the group of people racialized as black, instead of just saying the black race? It seems like people are still talking about the group of people racialized as black when they say the black race, even if they're mistaken about some aspects of it. Which is more difficult, introducing philosophical jargon like a racialized group into ordinary conversations, or just modifying what people think about a word that we mostly already understand? Sadly for us, just accepting social constructionism doesn't really settle it. When we say that race is a biological kind, we kind of know what that means. Races are just a genetic group that are significant in biology. When we say that race is not real, we also kind of understand that this means that race doesn't really refer to anything in the real world. So what does it mean for race to be a social construct? Well, there are many different ideas out there. Two views that we're going to compare in this video are cultural constructionism and political constructionism, as these are likely the most popular in the philosophy of race. Chike Jeffers defends the version of cultural constructionism that also includes elements of political constructionism. Jeffers claims that race is equal parts cultural and political. He claims that race is at least partially about a participation in a distinct way of life. According to Jeffers, W.E.B. DuBois, who is the dude when it comes to the social constructionist view of race, endorsed cultural constructionism. DuBois says,
What, then, is a race? It is a vast family of human beings, generally of common blood and language, always of common history, traditions, and impulses, who are both voluntarily and involuntarily striving together for the accomplishment of certain more or less vividly conceived ideals of life.
I'll repeat the important point here. A race is a group of people who have a common history and traditions. In other words, races have a common culture that distinguishes them from other races. For some, this might seem really obviously true, but for others, we'll analyze why Jeffers actually thinks this. First, Jeffers sees the creation of racial categories as a change in culture. Races exist as a social category in our society. Thus, we are socialized to act in a particular way. We are socialized to act as though there are differences between racial groups. So in order for races to even be created in the first place, there had to be a cultural shift in attitudes towards people of different races. Therefore, races are constructed out of cultural attitudes. Second, if cultural attitudes do construct race, then members of these new races will develop different ways of life in response to that culture. For example, as a result of racialization, Black people developed a Black culture. In the US, ethnic differences between enslaved Africans were purposely obscured and wiped out through slavery. As ethnic cultural distinctions faded away, racial cultural distinctions became more prominent. When you think about this, this makes sense. Organizers try to unite people based on common oppressions. I've often found that the more a boss sucks, the closer the relationships between the employees. Through exclusion and discrimination against different races of people, new bonds and cultures arose. People from rival ethnic groups found unity in their common oppression as Black or Asian or Native American people, and new cultural fusions grew. Third, imagine a Black child in the US learning about ancient African cultures. Imagine they learn about Great Zimbabwe, which is a capital city of an African kingdom that existed in the 11th to 15th century. Is that Black child wrong to have pride in their heritage when they learn about this? If race is purely a social construct and not about culture, then that child has no real connection to the Shona people who built Great Zimbabwe. There wasn't even a black race during that time period. It's unlikely that the child is a descendant of Shona people. But if there is a cultural component to race, then this child can have pride in the participation in today's black culture as a development of the culture of the Shona people and Great Zimbabwe. Let's dig further into education. Lots of news and recent research has focused around racism in curriculum design within schools. Many have charged that schools have a Eurocentric curriculum, meaning that it privileges the histories of white Europeans over other races. You can see this in some geography classes, where lots of students can name far more European countries and their capitals than African or Asian countries and their capitals, despite the fact that 1.2 billion people live in Africa and 4.5 billion people live in Asia, and only about 750 million people live in Europe. In history classes, large emphasis is placed on the empires of Europe, but little is said about the complex governments of the indigenous Americans or Indian Ocean trade routes. The stories of white Americans are talked about extensively, while black history is relegated to a single month. English classes learn about myths and legends from Europeans, but not Pacific Islanders. The examples go on. So why is this important? For one, it makes white people look like the only actors in history, while everyone else was passive or backwards. It also has an impact on student engagement within the school system. Research indicates that a Eurocentric curricula contribute to higher dropout rates of black Americans. In schools that take an Afrocentric view, where they focus on black people, there is some data that dropout rates among black students are lower and grades are higher. So cultural constructionism is appealing, but the cultural constructionist does need to show that there is a common culture across ethnicities within a certain racial group. How do we do this without appealing to racist stereotypes or a whitewashed history? An example that Jeffers uses is Native Americans. Indigenous peoples are stereotyped as having a closer connection with nature. But how far off is this stereotype? Certainly it doesn't apply to every single Native American person who may or may not be deeply connected with their own culture. However, isn't there actually a common thread across indigenous tribal cultures in the US that has a deep appreciation for nature, such as sustainable farming and hunting practices, reciprocity with the land, cultural myths, and environmentalism? This seems to be a similarity in culture across all the ethnic groups within the race Native American. Attributing this similarity to some kind of racial essence would be reverting back to traditional racial naturalism, but that's not really what Jeffers is saying. He is saying that we can look at the different cultures within a race, in this case Native American, and pull out some commonalities that differentiate those cultures within that race from cultures found in another race. There may be many Asian cultures, but Asian cultures have things in common that are not found in Black or African cultures. There's also a very different type of reason to accept cultural constructionism. When we imagine a future without racism, what does racial equality look like? Does racial equality mean that races don't exist? That people are merely members of different ethnicities that have different cultures, but there's no racial difference between cultures? Some people might have this view, but many people today believe that there are racial differences that we should preserve. These differences are not hierarchical or race supremacist, but cultural differences. In a post-racism society, people could still identify as Black, Asian, or white, or whatever, and this would still be a meaningful statement. Your race would still distinguish you by appearance and ancestry in a socially significant way, but not in terms of oppression or hatred or privilege or disadvantage, but in terms of culture. Again, W.E.B. DuBois seems to endorse this.
The fact still remains that the full, complete Negro message of the whole Negro race has not as yet been given to the world, that the messages and ideal of the yellow race have not been completed, and that the striving of the mighty Slavs has but begun. The question is, then, how shall this message be delivered? How shall these various ideals be realized? For the development of Negro genius, of Negro literature and art, of Negro spirit, only Negroes bound and welded together, Negroes inspired by one vast ideal, can work out in its fullness that great message we have for humanity. We cannot reverse history. We are subject to the same natural laws as other races, and if the Negro is ever to be a factor in the world's history, if among the gaily colored banners that deck the broad ramparts of civilizations is to hang one uncompromisingly black, then it must be placed there by black hands, fashioned by black heads, and hollowed by the travail of 200 million black hearts beating in one glad song of jubilee.
Cultural constructionism has a lot going for it, but a closer inspection reveals some cracks. Jeffers himself raises his own objection. White parents in the US commonly adopt children of different races, especially Black and Asian children. The Indian Child Welfare Act was enacted in 1978 to stop Native American children from being separated from their families by white adoption agencies. If race has a cultural component, what about a Black adopted child who experiences racism because of their Black appearance, but has no connection or interest in connecting with Black culture? That child is still Black, even though they don't have any connection with Black culture. This seems problematic for a socio-cultural constructionist. But is it? People of different ethnic groups have distinctive cultures, even though people in those ethnic groups don't participate in that culture to the same extent. Similarly, not everyone of a certain race experiences the same depth of racism as everyone of their race. If Black people don't have a uniform experience of racism and are still Black, then why should they have a uniform experience of Black culture? Also, really quick aside, I follow Jeffers in using Paul Taylor's distinction between race and ethnicity. Races are distinguished by ancestry and physical appearance. Ethnicities are distinguished by a shared ancestry and culture. Language and religion belong to ethnicity. Igbo and Yoruba are distinct ethnicities within Africa. This distinction isn't a problem for cultural constructionism about race because although races are distinguished by ancestry and physical appearance, this doesn't necessarily tell the whole story. Culture could still play a role in distinguishing races, which is the cultural constructionist position. The difference is that physical appearance doesn't play a role in ethnicity, just ancestry and culture. In short, race points to the body, while ethnicity points to culture. So maybe the adoption objection doesn't work, but there is something troubling about this. If race has a cultural component, then what does that mean for people who want to participate in another race's culture? According to Sally Haslanger, cultures are usually pretty porous. People can join different cultures in a lot of ways, through marriage, immigration, or even by converting to a new religion. Sally Haslanger agrees that cultural unity within a race can be great, but there are costs to racial segregation. People create authenticity tests to see if someone is Black enough or whatever. Offensive slurs like Oreo describe someone who is Black on the outside but white on the inside. And this happens with other racial groups with similar slurs that I will not list. But Sally Haslanger does. I wish I had the book with me still, but for some reason she decided that she needed to list like 10 or so slurs that mean like this race on the inside and another race on the outside. And I was like, why? I don't want to know these. I don't want to think about these. Why are they all food based? Why did you feel like you had to tell me all these slurs? Dr. Haslanger, there's no point. There's no point. I got it after just one or two is the max you really needed. If someone doesn't have the physical or ancestral credentials to belong to a race, can we exclude them from that culture? They shouldn't be allowed to perform those ways of life. Some people might say, yes, that's cultural appropriation. But is every situation where a person of one race participates in the culture of another race cultural appropriation? I don't think so. What about cultural appreciation? If you think that now, would it still be cultural appropriation in a post-racism society where we have achieved racial equality? Even DuBois wasn't convinced that there is need for boundaries once racism has been defeated.
We believe it the duty of the Americans of Negro descent, as a body, to maintain their race identity until this mission of the Negro people is accomplished, and the ideal of human brotherhood has become a practical possibility.
Similarly, even if Jeffers accepts that people can be more or less active in their racial culture, we should consider the effects of adopting this view. More and more people in the Black community are saying things like, there's no one right way to be Black. But if philosophers of race tell people that race has an important cultural component, then doesn't that encourage these authenticity tests? And worse, many people today, recognizing that races don't have a biological nature, are replacing it with something similar where they say, well, they commit more crimes because it's part of their culture, not their nature, or other racist things. Jeffers can and does respond to this worry. He doesn't really see a reason why this has to be inevitable. Certainly it's something to watch out for, but everyone should be careful when communicating philosophy to the public. The cost of not acknowledging the importance of culture for the concept of race is worse than the cost of being extra clear. So there's an empirical point that hasn't been proved, in my opinion. Is there a common thread across ethnicities within a culture? Anthony Appiah emphasizes the diversity of African cultures. As one would expect from a continent of 1 billion people, Africa is extremely diverse. The cultures of Southern Africa differ from those of Eastern Africa, which in turn differ from those in Northern Africa, and those differ from Western Africa. And that doesn't include the African diaspora. African Americans can be so disconnected about Africa that some Black Americans still believe the worst stereotypes Europeans invented about the dark continent back in the 17th century. Black American culture is shaped heavily by slavery, Reconstruction, and the Civil Rights Movement. And while I acknowledge there is a common cultural trend within Black American culture, let's not forget how diverse the subcultures in the US are. Atlanta, the Bayou, Chicago, Oakland, Harlem, etc. are all diverse groups with distinctive ways of life. Black people in the Caribbean have very unique cultures as well. I'm not convinced that all of these groups, which are racialized as Black in the US, have commonalities in their cultures that are significantly distinguishes them from other races. But maybe I don't know. I'm not Black, and maybe that's why I struggle to see the threads. But it's easy for USians to believe that Africa is a monolith and discount the vast diversity within that continent. Again, I'm focusing on Black culture in Africa because that's something I'm familiar with. But there's possibly even more diversity in Asia and in the Pacific Islands. My point is I'm not really convinced by Jeffers' examples of common cultural threads within racial groups. This connects to another issue that Jeffers also recognizes, but I think this issue is more problematic than he realizes. If there is a cultural component to race, and in a post-racism society, races can continue to take pride in their distinct ways of life and cultures on equal grounds, what does that mean for white people? There is a history of white people taking pride in their race and culture, but that's sketchy, to say the least. White pride is a phrase historically used by racists to indicate support for white supremacy and racism. But if races are encouraged to take pride in their distinctive racial cultures, does that include white people? Jeffers does take this concern seriously, and he cites some other authors on how to positively affirm white identity while remaining anti-racist. But my problem is that the white identity, what is that? What is white culture? I admit that I didn't read the authors that Jeffers references, but I as a white person struggle to identify positive things done in the name of whiteness. It's true that white people have achieved great things in history, great works of art, some progressive political movements, and other beautiful ideas were created by white people. But is it fair for white people to feel a cultural connection to those achievements? These things weren't explicitly done in the name of whiteness. When the idea of whiteness was brought into these ideas, it brought with it racism, oppression, and genocide. What has been done in the name of whiteness has been some of the worst atrocities people have ever committed. Slavery, destruction of indigenous cultures, segregation, eugenics, Nazism. Jeffers claims that white people can take pride in their European heritage, but isn't that missing the point? I have no problem with white people taking pride in their distinctive ethnicities, Italian, German, Irish, but whiteness was a racial category invented to unite Europeans as the superior race. Whiteness and racism seem intimately intertwined. What unites white culture and distinguishes it from the cultures of other races, if there even is a white culture? It's hard for me to say anything positive at all about white culture. We can say positive things about ethnicities within the white race, like the French ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, or Italian cuisine, or the Czech language. But what positive things unite white people as a whole? I remember being in a university class and asking this same question, and the only answer I got was McDonald's. As a white person, I feel like the invention of whiteness has stolen something from me. I could have identified myself as a descendant of a great Italian or Austrian culture. Instead, my family's history was melded into an ahistorical blob called whiteness in order to justify a hierarchical system of subjugation. My actual ancestry and culture, i.e. my ethnicity, was pushed aside to serve the interests of a powerful racist aristocracy. I'm not really interested in keeping that invention around. To me, whiteness cannot be separated from racism. European heritage, I guess I could see, but not the race white itself. Maybe my whiteness blinds me from seeing the ways white people have common cultural threads, but for now I kind of see this as a serious problem with the cultural constructionist view. And it kind of provides a good segue into the socio-political constructionism. This video is long, but we have built up enough background to keep this last section short. Fortunately for us, Sally Haslanger has a very direct definition for race from the socio-political constructionist point of view. So let's tackle it step by step. Social political race, SPR. A group G is racialized relative to context C if and only if members of G are all and only those. Okay, pause. What? There is a lot of interesting stuff here. Basically, Haslanger defines race using racialized groups. Joshua Glasgow might have a problem with this. Glasgow defended anti-realism in the last video and used some thought experiments, like his Asian baby thought experiment, to argue that racialized groups are not the same as races. Chike Jeffers and now Sally Haslanger think that those are races. I agree with them that racialized groups and races are the same thing, but let's stay aware that that's controversial. Another controversial part of this is the relative to context C. This is a direction that our other philosophers didn't really use. Haslanger is implying that a group can be a race in one context, but not in another. Haslanger uses subscripts to denote which context she is talking about, because she believes that different contexts have different races. And this bears out in the data. If you research how Brazilians divide people into races, it's much different than how people do in the US. In the French Antilles, they have 9 different words to describe people with different amounts of black and white ancestry. Even in the US, critical race theorists point out that some legal definitions of race have changed considerably. In the case of Lum v. Rice, a Chinese student was told that they could not attend a white school, but that they must attend the black school in their area. Does this mean that Chinese people were black in that area? In other cases in US history, have made similar rulings about Native American children. Think about what this might mean for a biological racial realist like Quayshawn Spencer. Anyway, let's continue with Haslanger's definition of race. Who are observed or imagined to have certain bodily features, presumed in C to be evidence of ancestral links to certain geographical region or regions. Call this color. Okay, this first step is pretty uncontroversial. Race certainly seems to be about connecting bodily features to certain geographical region. Haslanger calls this color, but it can include hair texture or nose or eye shape or other features. Quayshawn Spencer might object because he believes that races could continue to exist even if they were visually indistinguishable. However, I think most philosophers of race would agree. Joshua Glasgow's Dalai Lama thought experiment, it does intend to demonstrate this. The part that's a little weird here is the word imagined. Here's where Haslanger differs from Glasgow. She refers to examples where people have the appearance of one race, but were actually another race. A classic example here is John Howard Griffin, who is a journalist who darkened his skin to pass as a black man in the segregated US South. And then he wrote about his experience in the book Black Like Me. Griffin, despite passing as black, remained white according to most people. Or take Gregory Howard Williams, a University of Cincinnati president who discovered that he was black at 10 years old. Williams believed that his father was just a dark-skinned Italian man, until one day his father revealed that he was actually just a light-skinned black man. Native Americans can and often do pass as different races, usually Latino or white. Asian people have a wide diversity of features, and it would be difficult to pick out a specific bodily features that apply to all people racialized as Asian. Generally, I think it's pretty easy to accept this point. Let's go on to the next step. Who's having or being imagined to have these features marks them within the context of the background ideology in C as appropriately occupying certain kinds of social position that are in fact either subordinate or privileged, and so motivates and justifies their occupying such a position. This step is more controversial. Haslanger says that those bodily features and the supposed ancestry associated with them take on a social significance. The way those features become significant is that people use them to rank groups socially, as in, this person has these features, which means they are from this region of the world, which means they are inferior to this other group. This is where Chike Jeffers might frown. Haslanger builds up the fact that races are socially ranked into the definition. In short, racism is what creates races, not the reverse. We will make Jeffers tremble a little more by adding Haslanger's last step. Whose satisfying 1 and 2 plays or would play a role in their systematic subordination or privilege in C. That is, who are along some dimension systematically subordinate or privileged when in C, and satisfying 1 and 2 plays or would play a role in that dimension of privilege or subordination. This last step actually seems pretty natural. If we accept that racial features play a role in people's belief about someone's place in a social order, and this is a background ideology of society, then society is going to systematically subordinate or privilege people based on those features. The controversial part is whether systematic subordination or privilege belongs in the definition of race. Couldn't systemic racism simply be a contingent fact about races? Haslanger says no, because for a group to be racialized, some system needs to be racializing them. Another interesting part about this last step is the or would play part. With this, Haslanger is including people outside of a society as members of racialized groups. Imagine a Chinese person who is unaware of the racial dynamics in the US. This person, even though they are outside of the US society, would still be Asian because they would be racialized as Asian if they ever came to the US. They don't need to be aware of that there is a race called Asian in order to be racialized as that. Haslanger's definition has benefits. Haslanger takes what Lionel McPherson might call a racial pragmatism approach. This means taking a definition of race that is most socially useful. For example, let's analyze what this sentence means. Whites have a higher educational achievement than Latinos. Haslanger translates this as a group that is marked as having recent ancestry in Europe and that is situated as privileged as a result, has higher educational achievement than those marked as having recent ancestry in Latin America and who are disadvantaged as a result. That is a mouthful. But this is what that sentence really means according to Haslanger. Notice that this translation automatically implies why whites have a higher educational achievement than Latinos. It could be that white people have a higher educational achievement than Latinos for another reason besides racial privilege, but there is a reason that appears very obvious if we use Haslanger's definition of race. Haslanger's main target is racial anti-realism. Haslanger accepts that the word race has baggage that makes using the word kind of dangerous. But we should also worry about colorblindness, which is the idea that ignoring racial differences altogether will be better. Glasgow wants us to talk about racialized groups to avoid this problem, but Haslanger thinks racialized groups and races are the same thing. What else would you call a racialized group? Also, a term like racialized group doesn't really seem very likely to catch on. Hey, have you met my friend Mark?
Maybe. What does he look like?
He's kind of tall, he's got dark hair, and he's a member of the group marked in the U.S. as based on imagined traits as having recent ancestry in Latin America, and as a result is disadvantaged relative to other racialized groups.
Oh yeah, I do remember him. Why do you ask?
Oh, well, we were just going to see that new movie. I think it's called Crazy Rich Members of the Group that would be marked in the U.S. as having recent ancestry from Asia, and as a result is seen as a threat to the privileged racial groups in the U.S.
Oh yeah, I love that movie. I was thinking of watching a movie too. Probably racialized group marked in the U.S. as having recent ancestry from Africa, and as a result was and continues to be oppressed by the dominant racialized group Panther.
Oh, that's a good movie. All right, I'll see you later then.
All right, take it easy, man.
Here's another example of the usefulness of the socio-political definition of race. Remember Sean from the phone call at the beginning of this video? That's based loosely on a real phone call that Sally Haslanger heard on NPR one time. Sean equivocates between skin color and race, but according to the socio-political definition of race, bodily features are not actually what's important. What's important is the racialization from having, or the imagined having, of those features. Asian people don't all have the same skin color, nor does anyone of a particular race. What Asian people do have in common is a systematic subordination in the United States as a result of a socially created racial hierarchy. So here's how this is helpful. An anti-realist would say that Sean was just using an incoherent definition of race. They could go up to Sean and say, hey man, races aren't real, only racialized groups are. But that's not really helpful in explaining to Sean why we should have affirmative action. What would be helpful is if we help Sean understand that skin color and other bodily features are some shortcuts that we use to connect people to geographical areas, and then we use this to rank different groups in a social hierarchy. If we understand this, or if Sean understands this, it's more clear how affirmative action intends to undo that racial hierarchy. Here's an objection to the socio-political view. Like I said, Haslanger's definition says racism creates race. If that's the case, then a future with no racism means a future without race. But that might contradict what we want for our future. We all want to end racism, but do we have to get rid of race? Race as a unifying force can be very positive. I think the decision between cultural or political constructionism depends a lot on your answer to this question. Can we have races without racism? Is it possible for race to be a positive force without the downsides? Can we end white supremacy without actually ending whiteness itself? I lean towards no. Jeffers accepts that racial differences are created by European imperialism and our hierarchical social structures that it created. This origin points to the socio-political constructionism. The origin isn't the whole story, but it does seem like a point in Haslanger's favor. We can also attack this from the opposite direction. Maybe racism can exist without races. Joshua Glasgow argues that racialized groups are not races. Recall his example with the witches. A group can be witchized, i.e. certain bodily features are assumed to be associated with satanic worship, and as a result, were systemically oppressed. But that doesn't really make witches real. How is this different than Haslanger's account of race? Obviously, Haslanger believes that race is different somehow. As you might have guessed, I kind of lean towards social constructionist views of race. And because I have problems with cultural constructionism, I'm attracted to socio-political constructionism. It aligns well with my view of what whiteness and racism are intertwined. But what if we didn't have to choose just one theory? In the last video, I presented Quayshawn Spencer as a biological racial realist. He sometimes uses this term to describe his own view, but I was actually misrepresenting him a little. Recently, Spencer has called himself a radical racial pluralist. I presented him as a biological racial realist earlier to avoid complicating this discussion, but now I'll say a little bit about Spencer's actual view, which I find kind of appealing. Racial pluralism says that there is no single dominant view of race. Spencer compares it to Sally Haslanger's socio-political stance. Haslanger's theory is monist. because she believes that her theory describes the dominant usage of the word race in the US. But if we combined Haslanger's view with the biological racial realist, or with some other view, we could say race is a racialized group and real in context X, but also race is the genetic cluster groupings referred to by the US Office of Management and Budgets in context Y. In other words, race means different things in different contexts. In addition, a radical pluralist says neither of these is the dominant usage of race. Because this video is already very long, I will let you think of some defenses or objections of racial pluralism yourself. If you'd like more, consider reading Quayshawn Spencer's article, A More Radical Solution to the Race Problem. I hope that you take the time to consider the different positions that someone can have on race. And I also hope that you don't take anything I said as the final word. There is so much more that you can read. But I hope that this was enough that you can give you a starting place and you can see where people are coming from in different discussions about race. I'm going to post a bunch of sources in the description as well as extra resources that you can look at yourself. Thanks for watching.